I need to talk about Titanfall 2 because, in my opinion, even still 9 years later, it remains one of the most underrated and, in a lot of ways, underappreciated games ever made. Now, that's like a really loaded statement, but when you have fans calling for a sequel nearly a decade on, it's a strong sign. It's almost reached that mythical status where something, well, I would have said something like Skate before its new release just now, and of course something like Bloodborne, where you'd have people in Twitch chats and YouTube chats of live streams every time we'd reach the release cycle of new game announcements. We'd always have Titanfall 3 spammed in chat all the time, still now. And I think that's just reflective of how passionate myself and so many other people are towards the franchise and the IP. Titanfall 1 was a game which was in a lot of ways quite unremarkable. It was meant to be the big flagship system seller, the real big push for Microsoft's redemption arc within the Xbox One and PS4 generation, but it just never really landed for a lot of reasons. And I think it was because, unlike its sequel, it didn't do the basics right. It was a real only focus on multiplayer. It's had a weird multiplayer campaign hybrid where you do it online with other players. It was a unique experiment, but nothing that really stuck or worked particularly well. The core gameplay loop was fun, but there was a severe lack of maps, weaponry, and overall content, which led the game to, although be fun in spells, to not have a lot of staying power as a result. But I think, I saw the potential in that game, and I did want for a sequel, but I didn't particularly expect it. So when we got, a second release in 2016, a few years later, it was a bit of a surprise, and I'll be the first to say I wasn't particularly excited for it because I wasn't sure it was going to be any different from the first. But I was so happy to be proven wrong, because it essentially was everything you would ever want in a sequel, which is more of the same, just bigger, expanded upon, and better in every facet. And that's exactly what Titanfall 2 was. But the sad reality, which I'm sure you know, is it was a game that was doomed to fail completely from the start, because EA, the publishers, decided to release it in between the two biggest FPS titans, no pun intended, of all time in terms of IP and pedigree, namely Battlefield 1, which was, the franchise's biggest and most hyped release, arguably ever, following that insane trailer, which I'm sure you know and I've talked about on here, and the polarizing Infinite Warfare Call of Duty release. But at the end of the day, it's still Call of Duty, and it was still always going to do well. EA decided to release it directly in between that, with far little marketing budget than either of the other two options, and that kind of doomed it to fail, as I said earlier, from the get-go, from the launch, which is a shame, because after playing through all three of those games, I can tell you, in my opinion, firsthand, that Titanfall 2 is talked about and I think received far more positively than both of those games. It was the first FPS in recent memory that I can think of which really pioneered, in terms of the mainstream, a fast-paced movement system on that scale. Obviously, you had games back in the day like Quake, Unreal Tournament, which were more arcade style. Titanfall 2, I think, just did it in a different way, which we saw Call of Duty adopt massively in its later releases. And there was just something so magical about it. It had that, really quick time to kill, in combination with the Titan element, which offered a sort of different angle for combat throughout a single game. It was fast-paced fun, and struck the perfect balance between a high skill ceiling, which, appeased the hyper-competitive players, but equally just, it was fun, blind fun to play for the core masses, who just wanted to jump in and have some fun. It appealed to everyone, but didn't sacrifice on any of its design elements to get there. It was just good across the board. And obviously there was so much more features in terms of Titans, type of Titans, weaponry, maps, as I mentioned earlier. All my grievances in that regard were remedied and fixed in the sequel, but most important of which of course I have to talk about in terms of my love for the game and why so many people loved it in the first place, was the inclusion of a standalone single-player campaign, which I think at the time in the mid-2010s were begun to sort of become neglected in the mainstream FPS like sort of genre, like Call of Duty, like Battlefield. They were much more highlighted and focused on the multiplayer at that point in time, Titanfall 2 brought us right back to, an era, you could argue, sort of the late 2000s, early 2010s, where campaigns were the forefront, were a big selling point, and were pushed in the marketing. Titanfall 2 took us back there and brought us a story which, although was quite short, and I could just really wish it was longer, was so incredible for what we got. It did the basics perfectly. It had a compelling characters, namely BT, the Titan, which your Titan companion, which you shared a bond with and learnt to love and grow with over the course of the story. And of course, the core gameplay loop, which makes Titanfall so special, that was already a given. But also the awesome concepts and level designs, which were brave and really unique for a campaign at the time. I think of the one sequence near the end of the game. I'd say spoilers, but the game's nearly a decade old, so I'm going to go there. I don't care. There was just a particular level near the back end where you are in pursuit of another ship and you're jumping from giant freighter to freighter mid-air in a high-speed chase on your Titan, and it was just awesome. Felt like something out of a sci-fi Hollywood movie. And also, I'm sure the most infamous mission that you probably know was the time travel mission, which offered some incredible visuals and really a unique approach to gameplay in terms of refreshing an FPS type game. That's hard to do within a genre that's so saturated and so overdone. Even in a campaign setting, no less, Titanfall 2 really managed to find something special there. And as I said, in every facet, it was something that stuck with me, even still now. And like so many others, I was clamoring, praying for a sequel, a third game, to really not just expand on the story we got in 2, because they teased it at the end of the campaign, but also just make something perfected, really just complete every feature that made Titanfall 2 special and just level up the ante even more with a bigger stakes, bigger budget, just do everything better. And it's so sad that that's not what we got due to one simple reason, or 2 words: Battle Royale. And I'm sure you know where I'm going with this, and I get annoyed when I'm even thinking about it, because if you don't know, Apex Legends, which is essentially a battle royale set within the Titanfall universe, was developed by Respawn, and I'm sure pushed and maybe even forced by EA. That is an allegation, I'll say, allegedly, to be made because of the rise of PUBG and of course Fortnite just afterwards. They wanted to ride that wave with their own iteration, let's say, and setting it within the Titanfall universe, within the Titanfall sort of gameplay loop and weaponry and systems. I mean, it was a no-brainer to success, and with the unique marketing strategy of nothing being said about it except from handing their game out to streamers just before release, Apex Legends exploded into popularity and became a household name almost pretty much overnight in terms of the battle royale genre. It's still popular even now, even perhaps not to the same extent that it was, but that's, years later. But the real trade-off for that was, although we had a new healthy player base and a new healthy game within the Titanfall universe in Apex Legends, the downside to that was the sacrifice of the Titanfall sort of IP as we know it, in terms of the fact that I've come to the conclusion that we aren't really ever going to get a third game. And there was rumors in circulation even a year or 2 ago that they were talking about development, but they were quickly shut down. Because at the end of the day, this industry on the macro scale, to the bigger studios, the bigger companies, is more about the money rather than the end product of an incredible game, right? And I'm sure the developers and Respawn are proud of what they made, and I'm so happy with what they have made as well in terms of Titanfall 2 and even the first game in many ways. But to the publishers, to the investors, it's really about that bottom line. It's about how many zeros there are in the bank account and the bonuses. And for that reason, I don't see a realm in which we're getting Titanfall 3, because Titanfall 2, although it has an incredible cult following and is still popular within a core amount of players even now, never really sold as much as it probably could have done. And of course, I would say that's largely in part due to its botched release. Some would say otherwise, but regardless and irrespective of those opinions and what people would say, it's a game which holds a special place in my heart, I'm sure so many other people's, and stands alone as arguably, in my opinion, the best competitive multiplayer FPS ever made. I don't even care that might be a hot take. Some people would disagree with it, But again, this is my channel. It's my place to talk about the games that I love. I'm sure so many of you do too. Thank you so much for watching, listening to me ramble each and every day that I post on here. It's a privilege, and I really enjoy making them, as I always say. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. What are your experiences with Titanfall and everything in between? Let me know. Thank you so much for listening, watching, and I will see you on the next one. Have a good one.